FORA.tv. The world is thinking.
In my book Colossus, I argued that for all of its astonishing economic power and its superiority in military terms, the United States was constrained, like Gulliver, by three fundamental deficits. And these deficits I'm going to briefly run through. I'll almost update you. Some of you may have heard me make this argument before because I think I first made it here. The three that I wrote about were the financial deficit, the manpower deficit, and the attention deficit. But since I wrote Colossus, I've realized that I missed out a deficit. There's a fourth deficit that constrains Gulliver, and that is the legitimacy deficit. Let's reflect for a moment on the financial constraint under which Gulliver labors. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the total spending of the United States in the war on terror is likely to amount to between $1.2 and $1.7 trillion by 2017. That's less than the Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz estimated not so long ago. He put it at 2.2 trillion. Now, I want to give you some good news. That sounds like a whole lot of money. It's not. Even if you take Stiglitz's figure, spread out over that many years, it's little more than 1% of the United States gross domestic product. More good news. The defense budget is still, even after all these interventions, significantly lower as a percentage of GDP than at any time during the Cold War. The bad news is that this expenditure has been substantially financed by borrowing, that the gross federal debt is progressing inexorably upwards in the direction of $13 trillion. This leaves out of account a large unfunded liability on the side of the US welfare system, particularly in the case of Medicare, that some economists estimate as being north of $60 trillion. The bad news continues. A rising proportion of US borrowing is financed from abroad, increasingly by Asian central banks and Middle Eastern oil exporters. Half the federal debt in public hands is now in the hands of foreigners. And further bad news, if for any reason long-term interest rates should rise, and there is some reason to expect that, the fiscal problems of the United States will worsen as the interest rate burden grows. So the financial deficit, the constraint on Gulliver that was central to my early work, has not gone away, and it's likely to become more binding for the next president. That must put a limit on how far Part 3 of the Bush Doctrine can credibly be pursued. Bringing freedom to the entire world in all those different respects that the committee came up with is an astonishingly bold, and I would say imperial project that may be beyond the means of the American Colossus. The manpower deficit isn't going to go away either. The United States has about 75 million men of military age, but it draws on a tiny fraction of them in pursuit of its unspoken empire. There are barely 1.5 million Department of Defense personnel on active duty. Barely 250,000 of them are outside this country. Right now in Iraq, there are 171,000 soldiers. That means there are 157 Iraqis for every one American serviceman. In 1920, when Britain successfully defeated an insurgency in Iraq, that ratio was 23 to 1. Ladies and gentlemen, there has not been a surge. This is a misnomer. What has happened in the last 6 months or so has been a return of the US presence in Iraq to its end of 2005 level, after a, to my mind, disastrous dip in 2006. As a result of restoring troop levels to the 2005 peak, there has in fact been significant success in reducing the level of violence in Iraq. These are numbers for the number of all coalition troops killed in Iraq as a proportion of troop strength. You can see how it deteriorated in 2006 and how it's improved. There's been a similar pattern in mortality for Iraqi civilians. You can see from this chart, by the way, these data all come from the Brookings Institution, which does the best quantitative survey of Iraq. You can see that in 2006, as troop levels went down, there was an explosion of ethnic conflict in Iraq, a disastrous failure for US policy. Since General Petraeus got troop levels back to where they were, there has been a commensurate improvement in the situation in Iraq, though we're still far from being there. The lesson, to my mind, is very simple, although it's almost impossible to find this message in the American media. More US troops does work. Fewer US troops leads to carnage. It's as simple as that. My fear, however, relates to the third deficit, the attention deficit. Most Americans do not want to hear what I just told you. They do not like it at all. 71% say things are going badly in Iraq. 62% think it was a mistake to go to war in Iraq. And 59% believe that a timetable should be set for withdrawing US troops from the country. Despite the very obvious inference to be drawn from what I have shown you, that to withdraw US troops even a small amount will cause the violence in Iraq to resume, and to withdraw US troops entirely will plunge not only Iraq, but the greater Middle East into a war that hasn't been seen at any time in that region, but perhaps best resembles the war that raged in Central Africa in the 1990s. Now, of course, there's much less oil in Central Africa than in the Middle East, so the costs of mega war in Central Africa were relatively low. I leave you to imagine what the costs of a mega war in the Middle East would look like. Let me say a few words about the fourth deficit that I failed to identify when I wrote Colossus. One of the most fascinating things to emerge from recent global opinion surveys is that the US is unpopular not so much in the countries that the US identifies as its enemies, such as Iran, but in countries that are supposed to be friendly to the United States. These percentages are the unfavorability ratings towards the United States in a succession of countries. 83% of Turks have an unfavorable view of the United States, 79% of Saudis, 78% of Jordanians, 78% of Egyptians. Note, Egypt, a country that's received almost as much aid as Israel from the United States since the 1970s. Pakistanis, 68%. All of those countries are significantly more hostile to the United States than Iranians are. And this is one of the great ironies of American foreign policy. We have made ourselves astonishingly unpopular with our friends. And indeed, it is our friends who are in many ways the biggest source of a future terrorist threat. Future terrorist threats are much more likely to emanate from Pakistan, financed with Saudi money, than from any country that was identified in the axis of evil. Even the countries that Americans say are their best friends, which include Britain, Canada, and Germany, have turned against the United States since 2001 in a most remarkable way. According to opinion surveys, Britons rank Germany and Japan above the United States in terms of their favorable attitudes. And that, when you consider how long-lasting memories of World War II are in my country, is a truly remarkable thing. Canadians, by and large, think that US foreign policy pays no regard to the interests of others. 66%, two-thirds of Germans, have a negative view of the United States. And nearly half of Germans surveyed by Pew think that American foreign policy aims, quote, to dominate the world. This is a spectacular legitimacy deficit for US foreign policy. And it seems to me the more troubling because it's our allies who are turning against us most.